Hey guys, how you doing you all? In this video we are going to see part 1 of What if Deku's power was a curse, not a quirk? And please do check out story named Devil Fruit Izuku Model. Yummy Yummy no Mi by Simuvala. And make sure to leave a like, share and subscribe. And I have Patreon where I upload uncensored Deku lemons. So do check out. Let's get into the video. Ever since she knew she was expecting, Inko's outlook on life changed drastically. She was going to have her own child. She was going to give life to a little bundle of joy that'll grow to be a wonderful person through her love and hard work. At least, that was the plan, she told herself. Izuku's birth was not what she imagined in her head, the pain she expected, but what her son looked like, she did not. Izuku was born severely malnourished, with skin as pale as snow. Inko was immediately beside herself with worry, despite how tired she was when she saw her boy, but she didn't have much time to freak out, for the doctor attending her immediately whisked him away into an intensive care unit to try to save the baby, who seemed to be barely holding on to life. To his shock however, Izuku was completely fine. His skin, although being off-putting, did not seem to bring him pain. He looked malnourished, yes, but did not show symptoms of starvation. He was just as energetic as any newborn baby. The most off-putting thing, however, was Izuku's crying. The doctor in that room had himself delivered or helped in delivering multiple infants. He was accustomed to the sound of wailing, crying children. Izuku's crying, however, was unlike anything he had heard before. It wasn't the innocent crying of a newborn baby. It was a cry filled with anguish, sadness, despair and self-pity. It was as if the child was lamenting his own birth. When the doctor came back into Inko's room, he informed her on her son's condition and that although he did not look like it, it was stable and he did not seem to be in mortal danger. The doctor then went on to ask Inko about her and her husband's family history, if there were any reports of mutation quirks that looked like what Izuku had. After determining that no one in both families had ever had such a quirk, he determined that a mutation was a likely possibility to explain the infant's condition. The doctor then told Inko that there is no way to know for sure what Izuku had was a quirk, and so she would have to be incredibly careful with Izuku, and that they would have to monitor his condition as he becomes older to make sure nothing bad happens. She would have to watch what he eats, where he goes, extremely pale-skinned and the sun would most likely not mix well together, and what he does. And so that is exactly what she did. She was diligent to the utmost degree. Inko never let Izuku out of her sights growing up, even refusing her best friend's offer to get Izuku to meet her son, Kitsuki Bakugo, under the pretense that she didn't want to take any unnecessary risks and that they would meet once they knew for sure what it was that Izuku had. Inko even had to teach Izuku herself, too fearful at the prospect of sending him to a public kindergarten when they still didn't know his condition, and so she taught Izuku how to write, how to do math, his geography, etc. Growing up was hard for Izuku. He was naturally fearful at the slightest of stimuli. He even almost had a panic attack when a mail carrier rang the doorbell to leave a package at his house's door. Along with that, he almost never went a day without crying to himself. Izuku's crying was the hardest thing to endure for Inko. Each time she heard his cries, she felt herself die a little inside, blaming herself and her loins for having brought her son into the world in such a sorry state. That is why Inko tried her hardest every day to make Izuku smile, or to get him to laugh if only a little bit, because although he did not smile much, Izuku had a million-watt smile, and every time he did smile, it made everything worth it for Inko. Izuku, as suggested by the doctor at his birth, had gotten regular checkups not only to monitor his physical health, but also his mental health. He was growing normally, although he seemed a tad bit taller than would be considered normal, and they had learned when he opened his eyes for the first time as a baby that his eyes were completely white. They thought he was blind at first, but he showed to be able to respond to visual stimuli, therefore adding another thing that made his condition baffling to the list. Mentally however, they learned that Izuku suffered from scopophobia, the irrational fear of being stared at by people. With childish phrasing, he explained that it was the reason he cried so much, the thought of being stared at terrified him, and people looking at him made him uncomfortable. So far, his mother was the only one he felt comfortable allowing to look at him for a long time, although his face was the place he hated people to stare at the most and would ask her not to look at him too long in that area. After a few years and many tests, the doctor gave his all clear. Izuku's condition did not seem to hurt him physically. His scopophobia was still a mystery as to its origin, but the doctor theorized that it must come from his quirk. He told them that come the time when he develops his quirk, it should be safe to integrate him into normal life. Then came the day to see if he would get a quirk, or if what he had even was his quirk. Inko had taken her son to the doctor he had usually gone to do his checkups. He was the only person he felt comfortable with and trusted to inspect him. They get to his office. Izuku had put on a medical mask, sunglasses and a hoodie to hide his face. After having learned of his fear, Izuku and Inko had experimented on ways to make him feel more comfortable going outside where other people could look at him, and they found that covering his face up so you couldn't fully see it made him less shy and fearful. They arrived at the doctor's office and waited in the waiting room. Inko started softly as to not scare Izuku. "So Izuku, are you excited? Today we'll find out what your quirk is." "Huh? Oh, yeah. I guess I'm excited, mommy. I just hope that it isn't a flashy quirk like explosions or super strength. I'd want one like yours, mommy, it doesn't draw a lot of attention." She chuckled. "I'm happy that's what you want, baby, I'm very proud of you." "Thanks mommy," he said, then proceeding to give her a hug. "Izuku Midoriya. The doctor will see you now," the receptionist said out of the blue, making Izuku jump. SHH, SHH, it's okay Izuku. Trying to calm her son down. "Yes, that's us," she says to the lady. They then get up from their seats and go into the doctor's office, and they were greeted by the medical professional they had come to know over the years. "Hello Ms. Midoriya. Good to see you again, same to you Izuku, how are you feeling today?" he greets. "Hi Mr. Sugimoto, I'm doing okay, I guess. Not as bad as usual, at least." "That's great, it means we're making progress. Anyways, you've come today for your quirk apprehension, right?" "Yes, we did. I do hope today's apprehension will shed some light on Izuku's condition. It would make me feel a lot better for when he finally starts going to school." "As do I, Ms. Midoriya." She chuckles. "Stop calling me that, Riku, I've already told you we've known each other long enough to be on first name basis, so call me Inko." He laughs too. My apologies." "As do I, Inko. Anyways, let's get started. I'm going to take Izuku here in a separate room to do a couple tests, we shouldn't take more than an hour." "Alright, that sounds good to Izuku. Come on Izuku, go on and follow Mr. Riku, you know he'll take good care of you." Alright mom, see you later." Finally, both Dr. Sugimoto and Izuku leave the room. After about an hour, Izuku returns to the room where Inko was waiting and tells her that the doctor told him that he would review the test results and would come back into the room once he was done with them. After a short waiting time, he came back into the room, looking slightly off. "So Riku, what's Izuku's quirk?" The doctor sits down in his chair, takes in a big breath, and sighs. "Would you like the good news or the bad news first?" Both greenettes were startled by the sudden change in attitude from the doctor, Inko starting to get worried and Izuku starting to tear up slightly and to shrink into himself. "The good news, I guess," Inko says hesitantly. "Well, I've found that Izuku is resistant to pain and can heal himself." He begins. "While I was taking a blood sample, I realized something. Normally during our usual checkups, I would only take a little bit of Izuku's blood using a small syringe, something that only stings for a few seconds, but today I needed a larger sample, so I used a bigger needle that is supposed to hurt more, but Izuku didn't bat an eye at it. I asked him if the needle was hurting him, he said that it did, but that the pain didn't bother him. So, to confirm my hypothesis, I ran Izuku through a couple pain endurance quirk tests, and as far as I can tell, Izuku isn't affected by pain. I'm guessing Izuku never got into any altercations in the past few years, or else you would have found out and alerted me, but that's details, the fact of the matter is he's apparently not bothered by pain." "Oh, okay. That's good, it's not a flashy quirk, just like how Izuku wanted." "Hold on now, I'm not finished. Normally I would say this is a bad thing, we feel pain for a reason, it tells us what's wrong with our bodies, but Izuku seems to have that aspect covered. A lot of things seem to be wrong with his body, we've all known that for a long time, but every test comes back negative, and Izuku himself says that he feels fine, at least physically that is." So, after realizing that the puncture wound that was supposed to have been left by the needle seemed to have disappeared, it got me thinking that Izuku also had a self-healing aspect to his quirk. So, I evaluated him for that too. We started by cutting a small gash into his arm after confirming with Izuku that it did not hurt him and waited to see if the wound would close itself back up. After about a minute, the wound had healed completely without scarring. "That's great. You hear that Izuku? You have a quirk that's powerful and that isn't flashy, isn't that great?" "Yeah, mom, I guess it is," he says, a smile creeping onto his face. Dr. Sugimoto coughs. Sorry to rain on your guys' party, but I haven't gotten to the bad news." The family then stops celebrating and returns to their serious attitude, waiting for the doctor to continue what he was saying. "So, as I was saying, there are some bad news. The thing is, Izuku does not have a quirk." "Huh? But Riku, I thought you said that he did." "No, I said he was resistant to pain and could heal himself, not that he had a quirk." Inko looks towards Izuku, who is just as confused as she is, then looks back to the doctor. "I'm sorry, I don't really understand what you're getting at, is this a joke? If so, this is in poor taste, Riku." "I assure you, Inko, that I am not joking. Studies have shown a link between bone structure and quirk development, more specifically, every person who develops a quirk lacks a joint in their pinky toe that other quirkless people have, and Izuku has that joint in his pinky toe. So, Izuku here is quirkless yet he possesses a quirk, or some sort of power. So, what does this mean, Riku? It means we're still no closer to understanding Izuku's condition. I have no idea what he has, and how his body is doing the things that it does. For the first time in my medical career, I'm stumped. This is what Izuku feared, he was quirkless, everyone would point at him when he would go to school, everyone would laugh, everyone would look at him, his worst nightmares were coming true. Izuku curled himself up into a ball and started to cry to himself, terrified at what his quirkless status would entail. I knew this would happen. I knew it would. He says between sobs. Inko goes up to her son and hug him, trying to comfort him and quiet his crying. SHH Izuku, everything will be alright. No one will look at you, no one will judge you. Seeing Izuku in the state he was trying to get him out of, the Dr. Sugimoto starts to regret putting it to them so bluntly. Look Izuku, we do not know a whole lot about quirks, they are still a big mystery to us. Yes, studies have shown a correlation between the pinky toe joints and quirks, but that's only in cases we've seen so far. It's possible that you are simply an outlier. Look, you clearly have a power, you're happy about that, right? Izuku starts to calm down slightly and responds to Ruki between quieter sobs. Yeah, I guess I am, it's a quirk that doesn't draw much attention. Well then that's that, if you have a power, we'll write it down as your quirk. We'll put the fact that you possess an extra toe joint as a footnote, no one will look that deeply into it, it'll say you possess a quirk, so just tell everybody you have a quirk, okay? Izuku lifts his shade for a moment to wipe his eyes of his tears. Why yeah, I guess I can do that. Good, then we're done here. Congratulations Izuku, you have a great quirk. Now, how about I give your mom a little bit of money to buy you some katsudon to celebrate, Inko, after getting up alongside Izuku, walked up to Riku. Oh Riku, you don't need to do that, I'll gladly pay for it myself to congratulate Izuku. Nonsense, I insist. It's the least I could do. Inko rolls her eyes. Oh fine, you big dope. Thank you, I deeply appreciate it. No problem, it's my pleasure. With that, they both leave. While in the car, however, Inko was restless. They knew Izuku had a power, but they did not know its origin. Even worse, they had learned next to nothing about Izuku's condition. She wasn't going to make it, if she sent Izuku to school she would die of worry, she just couldn't do it. But Izuku needed it, he couldn't stay on their house forever, there would come a day when she wouldn't be able to protect her dear Izuku, so he needed to learn independence, how to take care of himself, and how to interact with others. She had to do it, she had to send him to school, or else she would be hurting him more than anything. She'd be damned if she didn't send him in with someone to look over him, however, so she turned to her son and said. Hey Izuku, how would you feel about meeting the son of mommy's bestest friend? His name is Katsuki Bakugo. Katsuki Bakugo was confused when his mom had asked him to come with her to see Auntie Inko. Auntie Inko had never even once for as long as Katsuki was alive asked them to come over to her house, she had been invited and she had asked to come to their house before, but they never once stepped a foot into her own. When Katsuki had wanted to see Auntie Inko at her house once, his mom had called her, saying how it would be nice for him and Auntie's son to meet. He couldn't quite hear what she had said, but he caught on that she was distressed at the proposition. He could see his mom be quite surprised herself at the unexpected outburst before settling back down, after Auntie Inko presumably apologized for being brash. He couldn't make out anything after that, but his mom told him afterwards that Inko was preoccupied with her son and that it wasn't going to be possible, but that she could come over to their house later. So why now, of all times, did she want them to come over? Furthermore, why did she ask for his mom to bring him along with her? He was fine with seeing his aunt, but she had never asked to see him specifically, it was always her wanting to see his mom. Was he finally going to meet that son that his mom mentioned? But if that was the case, why now and not before? Something felt off to him and he wanted to know what it was. When they arrived, Inko was already outside waiting for them. They got out of the car and walked up to her to say hello, his mom stating how happy she was that both their sons finally were going to meet each other. Ah, so he was right, he was finally going to meet his auntie's son. Took her long enough. Before they could continue any further, however, Inko started to explain to them why she wanted them to meet today and why before today wasn't possible. So Mitsuki, I've already told you about Izuku's condition, so you don't need it explained to you, but if you've never told Katsuki about it, then he needs to know before meeting him. So, have you explained it to him? Inko asks, getting serious. No, I never did. I knew we didn't know a lot about his condition, so I didn't think it'd be a good idea to tell him about it before we knew more. Katsuki was offended at this revelation. His mom had kept something from him. The gal of that old hag. Huh? "What the fuck haven't you been telling me, mom?" "Shut it, you damn brat." She responds while striking the top of his head with a balled fist in language, "I did it so you wouldn't judge him before meeting him." A yelling match then ensued between the two firecrackers, which was starting to garner unwanted attention by passers-by. Guys, people are starting to stare," Inko says, trying to calm the situation. Itsuki coughs, regaining her composure before slapping the back of Kitsuki's head after saying, "Sorry, you know how my brat sometimes mouths off when he shouldn't." Inko laughs awkwardly. "Yeah, you do say that a lot." Inko then regains her serious attitude and continues. "Anyways, like I was saying, I want Izuku and Kitsuki to meet. Our doctor recently gave us the all clear for Izuku to be put into normal schooling since his condition doesn't seem to be affecting him physically. The reason why I wanted them to meet is that while he's not physically unwell, he is very mentally fragile and he'll need help while he is at school. I know how stressful first social interactions can be and his condition will make it twice as hard for him, so he'll need a friend going in." "So, Auntie's son needs a friend, huh? He better not be a damn extra like all the others at school, if so, he didn't think it was going to be possible for them to get along. So, before meeting him, I want you to know about his condition and how you should approach him," she says, crouching down to Kitsuki's eye level and giving him a pleading look. "Izuku means so much to me, I think I'd die if anything were to ever happen to him. Please, could you promise me that you'll be his friend and that you'll protect him?" Itsuki looked into his mom's best friend's eyes and saw how desperate she was. He could see how much her son meant to her. He couldn't say no, a hero wouldn't, a hero would stand strong and say, "Ha. That's no problem for the likes of me." Fuck it, he wasn't going to back down, and if this kid ended being an extra, he would just have to deal with it. "Fine, I guess, but he better have a good quirk if we're going to hang out." Inko laughs. "That's not going to be a problem, Izuku has a strong but low-profile quirk, just like he wanted." "Low profile? Why would he want that?" Kitsuki retorts. "I'm getting to it, Kitsuki, don't worry. The reason why he wants a low-profile quirk is because of his condition, which I think is time that you learn about. You see, Izuku was born different from me and you, his body isn't the same as everyone else's, neither is his mind." She gets up from her crouched position to get more comfortable. "Izuku's skin is very pale, so pale we thought the sun was going to be a problem for him when he was born. His eyes are all white, but he isn't blind, you won't have to worry about that. He's taller than normal for his age, probably the most tame aspect about his condition, and he is extremely thin. We've tried different diet plans, but his body seems to just stay the way it is, no matter what we do. That's the simplest part out of the way, now on to the harder part. You see, Izuku has scopophobia." Scopophobia? Kitsuki had heard about phobias, from what he understood it basically meant you were really scared of something. So, what, he's deathly afraid of scopes? That's kinda stupid. If you don't know what scopophobia means, it means he hates being looked at, it scares him. So, when we go into the house, please don't stare at him, especially in his face, it's the place he hates being stared at the most. Okay. What about his quirk? I'm getting there, Kitsuki, I'm getting there. Well, the thing is, Izuku is technically quirkless. She says, to the shock of both Kitsuki and Mitsuki. Quirkless? You have got to be kidding, Kitsuki was starting to regret making this promise. Having a friend that's an extra would be at the very least bearable, but a quirkless nobody? He was about to retort when Inko continued what she was saying. And the reason why I'm saying technically quirkless is because, well, Izuku does have a quirk, but he's not supposed to. Huh? Not supposed to have a quirk? What the fuck did she mean by that? What? I don't get it. Kitsuki replies. Well, as you know, when you go to the quirk doctor to get an assessment on your quirk, they take an x-ray of your foot to see if you lack a second pinky toe joint because they've found that if you don't have it, it means you'll have a quirk. The thing is, Izuku has 2 pinky toe joints, which means he shouldn't have a quirk. However, despite that, Izuku does have a quirk. His quirk makes it easier for him to ignore pain and makes it so he can heal himself faster than you or I could. What? Kitsuki was getting more and more confused. A quirkless quirked kid. Who the fuck had ever heard of such a thing? So, he has a quirk. A quirkless quirk. ARRRGH. This is too confusing. Inko giggles. Yeah, that's what we thought too when we went to get his quirk assessed. Inko regains her serious face and looks towards the 2 blondes. So yeah, that's that. You guys now know all that we know about Izuku's condition. Let's go inside, shall we? They all start walking towards the entrance to Inko's house and before they can enter, she stops them. Before we go inside, could you please try to not make any sudden loud noises? They tend to scare Izuku pretty badly. The 2 Bakugas agreed and with that, they all enter the Midoriya household. You guys go sit down while I go and get Izuku, there's some refreshments on the table if you want any. Inko says, gesturing to their couch and turning to go get her son from his room. Both Mitsuki and Kitsuki went to sit down on the sofa, taking care to not make any loud noises like they were asked to. They sat there in an awkward silence for what seemed like an eternity, eating the snacks that Inko had laid out onto the table and drinking water every so often. Kitsuki suddenly started to get an unsettling feeling after a while. He didn't know if it was the house, the silence, or the amount of time Inko was taking to come back, but he didn't like it. The feeling grew and he was starting to get slightly scared. He was about to ask his mom if she felt it too, but before he could they heard Inko's footsteps as well as smaller ones coming towards the living room. Inko entered the room, a child wearing shades and a medical mask holding tightly onto her hand. "Sorry for taking so long, guys, Izuku was a bit scared of meeting you guys, but he feels better now," she says before letting go of the boy's hand and patting him in the back, encouraging him to move towards the Bakugas. "Come on honey, it'll be okay, they're very nice people, just imagine it's me or Dr. Sugimoto. You can do it." The child, after looking up at his mother one last time, gingerly approached the two and introduced himself while awkwardly looking away from them. "Hi, my name is Izuku Midoriya, it's nice to meet you." "Hi Izuku, my name is Mitsuki Bakugo, but you can call me Auntie Mitsuki, I'm your mom's friend." Mitsuki replied with a smile before looking at Kitsuki and gesturing for him to introduce himself. Kitsuki stared at Izuku for a while, which started to make Izuku feel uncomfortable. Please stop looking at me. I don't like being stared at." Kitsuki scoffs and suddenly hops off the couch, hastily walking up to the cowering child, which scared him further, making him shield his face with his hands. Both Inko and Mitsuki were surprised at Kitsuki's actions and were about to tell him to wait before he stopped in front of Midoriya and stuck his hand out, offering a handshake. "My name's Kitsuki Bakugo and when I grow up, I'm gonna be the next #1 hero. We're gonna be friends, so get ready because I'm not about to let no friend of mine be a useless extra." Mitsuki damn nearly choked on her own spit when she heard her son's cocky-ass greeting and was about to go up to him to give him some of her mind. But before she could, however, Izuku peeked at Kitsuki's hand from behind his own. He then slowly removed his hands from in front of his face and grabbed the blonde child's own before delicately shaking it. Thanks, I guess," Izuku says, now actually looking at Bakugo. So you finally decide to look at me then? What the fuck was that handshake? I thought you were physically fine, would you give me such a pathetic handshake, huh?" Izuku stuttered out before jumping at a sudden new voice. "You damn brat, language and stop being so damn rude," Mitsuki says before running up to her child and bopping him on the head. "What? I'm just trying to get him out of his shell." Inko runs up to her son, crouches down to his height and hugs him to try to comfort him before turning to the two firecrackers, currently having a shouting match. "Guys. Please, loud noises scare Izuku." Before anyone could say any more, however, Izuku took Kitsuki and pulled on his sleeve to get his attention. You said my handshake was weak, right? So could try again please." Mitsuki looks at Izuku then at Kitsuki and lets go of her son. The two children stood in front of each other and instead of Kitsuki, Izuku held out his hand offering a handshake. "Hi, my name is Izuku Midoriya. I'm glad you want to be my friend, so I'll try my best to show you I'm not useless." Izuku utters, this time much louder, with a newfound intensity in his voice, while firmly shaking his new friend's hand. Kitsuki scoffs and keeps on looking at Izuku, a grin now on his face. There might be hope for you after all. Mom. I want to go play with Izuku, can you give me the hero figurines I brought? Both Inko and Mitsuki were shocked at the sudden turn of events, Inko more so than anyone. Had she seen correctly? Her little baby didn't cower or start crying, she didn't need to go comfort him. He was actually talking with someone who he never met and showed less fear than he had ever before in his life. Shaking herself out of her shock, Mitsuki went to her purse to grab a couple hero figurines and handed them to her son, who then started walking to where Inko had come out of. "Your room's over here, right? Come on, let's go play." Yeah it is, wait up," the green child says before running to catch up to Kitsuki. Inko stood still where she was, too shocked and dumbfounded to move. "Should we go and supervise them or?" Mitsuki's question snaps Inko out of her trance, making her look towards her friend. I've never seen Izuku like this before, I think it's best we leave them alone. I don't want to interrupt whatever they're doing if it's making Izuku feel more confident." The two boys went into Izuku's room and played heroes with Kitsuki's action figures, Izuku actually having lots of fun with his new friend. Inko could hear Izuku's laughs from within the living room, making Mitsuki have to hold up the happy crying mess that Inko was at the moment. Kitsuki, after a while of playing, realized how barren Izuku's room was. "Why's your room so boring?" he asked. "Oh, well I don't really have a lot of interests." "What?" That's bullshit, everyone's interested in something. Well, how about your favorite hero, who is it? Is it All Might? I don't know who that is and I don't really watch hero stuff. This revelation shocks Katsuki, making him jump up onto his feet. What? You don't know who All Might is? Why? Katsuki's loud tone of voice scares Izuku, who starts to shrink into himself again. Well, I don't really watch TV, it feels too much like they're looking at me when they look at the camera, so I've never really watched hero stuff. Are you kidding me? You're so scared of being looked at that you can even handle when they're not even there? I don't know, it just makes me feel scared and uncomfortable. Ugh, okay, that's it. Katsuki runs up to Izuku and lifts him up, so he's standing in front of him. If we're gonna be friends, we're gonna watch hero stuff together. So, you're gonna let me look at your face so you can get over your fear enough that you can watch TV with me. What? And no, I don't want to. Izuku says while starting to shake. Come on, your face cannot possibly be that bad to look at. I don't care. I don't want to, I'd rather die than let anyone see my face. He says, now further and turned away from Katsuki and covering his face with his hands. Oh, come on. Do you not even let Auntie Inko look at your face? She's an exception. I know she won't think I'm a freak if she doesn't look at my face for too long. Katsuki sighs, walks up to Izuku and puts his hand on his shoulder. Look, I promise I won't judge you, I won't react, I won't say a word, just let me look at your damn face. Tell you what, if I react in any way, I give you full permission to punch me as hard as you can in the face, okay? Izuku says nothing. I don't give up, so either you let me, or I rip your face mask off and make you show me. Izuku says nothing. Hey. Answer him. You promise you won't judge me? Izuku says, his arms now on his sides but still shaking. Cross my heart and hope to die. Izuku takes a deep breath, then answers. Okay, I let you, but only for a few seconds, okay? Alright fine, we'll start with that. Still turned around, Izuku removes his sunglasses from his face, takes his face mask off and throws them both on the ground. He takes a few deep breaths before speaking to Katsuki whilst still not facing him, now shaking like a leaf. I really am only gonna let you look at me for a few seconds, and I'm holding you to that promise you made. I am not messing around when I say I'll really hit you hard. Blah, blah, blah. Just get to it already. With that, Izuku starts to turn slowly, now shaking as much as his body could possibly let him, until he is directly facing Katsuki, who is now looking at Izuku directly in his face. Fear. Fear is something that Izuku had come to know very well, he had never gone a day without being afraid of everything around him. The slightest of sounds were able to set him off, yet when Katsuki introduced himself, he didn't feel scared. We're gonna be friends, those are the words he said to him, he asked no questions, he didn't fear him, he wasn't disgusted by him, he held a lot of fire in the words he spoke to him, but none of it burned him. He stated that they were gonna be friends like it was a fact of life. Just as rain falls and flowers bloom, they were going to become friends. Izuku had never felt such certainty, such conviction, such headstrongness in anyone ever before. The other things he said about being the next #1 hero and that he would have to get prepared because he wasn't going to let an extra be his friend, all of it was laced in self-confidence and arrogance, but under that tough shell, Izuku understood something that no one else in the room did, maybe not even Katsuki himself. He understood that what he said wasn't a warning, it was a declaration. It was a promise that he would stick to Izuku's side. That was why he didn't feel fear, that was why he felt safe around his new friend. But even if Katsuki introduced Izuku to friendship, showing his face was something he wasn't as willing to do. When the blonde had asked for him to show him his face, Izuku was bewildered. Why? Why would he want to see his face? Why would he ask him to do something he despises so much? Weren't they supposed to be friends? He closed himself off, turning away from his new friend in protest. He would get nothing from him, he told himself. But in his flurry of thoughts, he thought about what his friend might have meant. If we're going to be friends, then we're gonna watch heroes on television together. Katsuki didn't care about watching TV, they were playing with hero action figures just fine not too long ago. What he wanted behind his juvenile request was to see his face because they were gonna be friends and you need to have trust in your friends. Izuku needed to trust Katsuki to not think of him as a monster after seeing his face, they needed to have this kind of trust if they were ever going to really become friends. And so after stealing his resolve, he willingly chose to let someone other than his own mother see his face for the first time in his life. The Katsuki, the moment must have been short but to Izuku time slowed to a crawl. After removing his mask and sunglasses from his face, he first felt the cool breeze from the AC caressing his face, making him shiver. After that, the fear set in. He had never let himself be in the same room as someone when his face wasn't covered. Even when his mom was in the same room as him, he would prefer to have his coverings on to mitigate the fear he felt, so to have his face laid bare while in the same room as someone he had only known for a short while made his hair trait skyrocket. But he needed to push through, he needed to do this for his friend, and so he forced himself to turn around and face Kitsuki. As he was turning around, getting closer and closer to facing the young blonde, he started hearing voices, first as whispers warning him against what he was doing. Then, the whispers became louder and louder until eventually they were all yelling at him to stop, begging for him to not show his face, and to turn back around. But, the young greenette didn't back down. "I won't listen to you, I have to do this," he told the voices inside his head, now with tears running down his face, and with one final push, he faced Kitsuki Bakugo. There are no words to describe the utter terror Izuku felt when his friend's gaze met his, he felt as though the world around him was shattering, and all that was left was him, and that awful, awful staring directed towards him. It was his turn to beg, to plead. He called out to the voices, asking them, begging them to bring him back, to make it stop, but the voices laid silent. After a while, however, something new appeared, something that Izuku had never felt before in his life, something that was burning and tearing at his very insides. Anger, pure white-hot anger. The voices then came back, but no longer were they talking to Izuku. Now, all they did was scream, they started screaming louder and louder and louder, until it reached a deafening degree. Izuku, becoming angrier and angrier by the second, was about to let out his own scream to try to quiet the voices down, but right before he could, a voice barely more audible than a whisper rung out to him. "Sna. Th. Uck. Out. Of. It." What was it trying to say? The VC was getting louder, eventually he could make out the words being said, a slurry of insults and demands to stop freaking out. He wondered to himself who this voice was that was overtaking the screaming ones, but before he could question its origin any further, he was shaken out of his stupor by an explosive fist connecting with his jaw. He blinked a couple times, his senses now coming back to him, and he could now see Kitsuki gripping him by his collar and shaking him. "Will you stop freaking out, you big fucking coward?" I didn't even flinch. His memory then came back to him what Kitsuki had asked to see his face and Izuku agreed to let him see it. Before Kitsuki could further berate his friend, Izuku opened his mouth up as wide as he could, let out a loud screech, and with all the remaining anger he had, he hit his friend in his face, making him fly across the room and into a wall. Now with the blonde's eyes off of him, Izuku scurried to get his mask and sunglasses off of the floor and back on his face, before getting into the fetal position and loudly crying to himself. Inko and Mitsuki had heard the loud commotion coming from where their sons were playing, and so hurried into the room to check on the two boys. Both of them were horrified at what they saw, and each individually went to check on their children. Inko tended to her son's healing, but still charred and cooked skin, and Mitsuki tended to her own son, who was now bleeding from his mouth, a tooth had apparently been knocked out by the greenette strike. "It's okay honey, it's okay. Shhhh, everything's alright," Inko said, trying to calm her son down who was now clinging to her. "I am so sorry," Izuku said, through sobs and hiccups. Kitsuki, you brat, talk to me damn it," Mitsuki yelled while shaking her injured son. "Stop shaking me, you old hag," Kitsuki said groggily while sitting up. Now with his vision back, Kitsuki turned towards Inko and Izuku, who were both hugging each other now, Inko comforting Izuku and Izuku, loudly repeating how sorry he was over and over again, and smirked. After getting up and stumbling a bit despite the protest of his mother, he went up to the green-haired duo, pulled Izuku off of his mother, the former shrinking and shielding his face with his hands while sobbing, and stared at him. Please stop looking at me, I didn't mean to hit you," Izuku said while peeking from behind his fingers. Kitsuki kept his harsh glare on Izuku before snickering. It worked. All three people present in the room with Kitsuki were confused. What had worked? What had he done? What? Izuku stuttered out. "You're so fucking scared of people seeing your face that you can't do anything. I saw your face, did the world end?" Well no, but nothing. You're not gonna die if somebody looks at you, so stop being such a fucking coward. Before he could finish his sentence, however, Kitsuki was struck on the top of his head by his mom's bald fist. "So you're the one who made this happen? And stop insulting Izuku, you problem child." "But I'm right. How is he gonna function if he's scared of his own fucking shadow?" Kitsuki replies while rubbing the top of his head. "Shut up," Mitsuki yelled to her child. "I'm so sorry Kitsuki made you show your face to him, dear. We need to go to the doctor to get his wound checked out, and after that we'll go home and he'll be grounded for a week," she said to Izuku, glaring at Kitsuki at the end of her sentence. "Come on, Kitsuki, we're leaving." "Oh come on. We just fucking got here." Mitsuki hit Kitsuki in the head again. "Language. Both of the Midoriyas stood still in Izuku's room, still shocked at the unfolding of events that they had just witnessed. Before Inko could speak up to Izuku, however, the young boy ran out of the room to the Bakugas who were just going out the door. "You Auntie Mitsuki?" Izuku asked hesitantly, causing Mitsuki to turn back around. Yes dear. Hey, after Kitsuki's not grounded anymore, could we see each other again? I want to watch hero stuff on TV with him." Mitsuki was surprised at the Greenette's newfound conviction, but gave back a warm smile anyway. "Of course, Izuku, I'm sure Kitsuki would be glad to see you again after he's learned his lesson." Izuku smiled under mask. "Thank you auntie. Oh, and sorry again for hitting you, Kitsuki. I promise I won't do it again." Kitsuki scoffed at folded his arms. "Don't worry about it, I promised I'd let you anyway. I just didn't expect you to have a damn strength quirk." "The strength quirk?" "Yeah, a strength quirk. There's no way in hell your skinny arms could break my tooth, no matter how well you throw a punch, it must have part of your weird quirk." Izuku paused and started thinking to himself, had he really hit him that hard? He couldn't really tell how much strength he put into his punch, he was too scared and angry to register it. Was this really a part of his quirk? Did he get stronger when people looked at his face? If so, he wouldn't be able to get much use out of it. There's no way in hell he was gonna let random people look at his face, so he could get a little stronger. Before he knew it, he started muttering his thoughts out loud, to both of the blonde's discomfort. Izuku, you're muttering," Mitsuki said, trying to get Izuku out of his trance. "Huh? Oh. Sorry, I didn't know I was thinking out loud," Izuku said while rubbing his head in embarrassment before getting serious again and bowing in front of the Bakugas. "Thank you for coming, I can't wait to see you again, Kitsuki." You better be serious when you say you want to watch TV together. When I come back we're watching an All Might marathon. I look forward to it, see you next week," Izuku said after laughing joyfully, earning a scoff from Kitsuki. "Yeah, whatever." And with that the Bakugas got into their car and left. After watching them leave, Izuku turned to his mother who had joined him shortly after he said goodbye and asked her. "Hey mom, could you schedule another appointment with Mr. Sugimoto?" "Why? Your cheek's fine now, are you feeling sick?" Inko asked worriedly, crouching down to get a better look at Izuku. "No, I'm fine, mom, it's just I'd like to talk to him about my quirk, that's all." After Kitsuki looked at my face something happened. It felt really painful and I heard voices screaming at me. Kitsuki pulled me out of it, but I got scared and so I hit him really hard when I came back to my senses so he would stop looking at me. I hit him harder than I thought I was able to, so I was wondering if maybe it's a part of my quirk. Inko gasped and hugged her son. "Oh honey, that sounds horrible. Don't worry, I'll call him and we'll get an appointment as soon as he's available." "Thanks mom," Izuku said while pulling away from the hug. "Oh, and thank you for getting me to meet Kitsuki. He's a bit intense, but I feel less scared around him." "You're welcome, Izuku, anything for you," Inko responded with a smile. Izuku, wanting to express his appreciation, pulled down his mask, placed a kiss on Inko's cheek and then returned to hugging her, enjoying his mother's calming embrace. "I love you mom." "I love you too, honey," she said, embracing her son tighter. "Now, I'm getting hungry. How about I get some food started for us?" Izuku gasped then uttered a yes please. Before detaching himself from his mother and running back inside. Inko sighed while looking at her son run back inside. It was the happiest she'd ever seen him, it brought a tear to her eye. No. Now's not the time for that, I've got a meal to cook." Wiping her tears away, she got up and walked back into her house. Izuku and Kitsuki continued to see each other and became good friends, although Kitsuki's rude attitude sometimes begged to differ. True to his word, Izuku watched Hero Media on his TV for the first time in his life with Kitsuki when his grounding was over. He did have to mentally prepare to do so before Kitsuki arrived at his house, but he pulled through and actually started to enjoy himself and eventually forgot about his fear. The first time Izuku saw a clip of All Might, he then and there understood Kitsuki's outrage at him not knowing about him. All Might truly was like no other. His smile, his laugh, his strength, he was absolutely the coolest. Izuku instantly became a fanboy and started collecting all of the All Might merchandise he could get his little hands on, brightening up his once dreary room. His All Might obsession eventually transformed into an obsession with everything hero related. In a world where he felt afraid of nearly everything, they made him think that he didn't need to be so scared. The two boys continued this ritual throughout their childhood. They'd meet up every so often to watch the newest heroes' debuts and freshest All Might clips. At some point, Kitsuki realized that while they would watch the television, Izuku would often scribble quickly in a notebook while muttering to himself quietly. "Hey. Izuku, what the fuck are you doing with that notebook?" "Huh? Oh, well I've decided something, Kachan." Izuku had started calling his friend by this nickname. Kitsuki, on the other hand, had not been able to come up with one to call Izuku he liked enough to stick with. So you finally got the balls to take action on something. Okay, what is it? Izuku took a breath in then out and continued. I've decided, Kachan, that I want to be a hero. If I'm gonna be a hero, I thought it'd be smart to start analyzing quirks now, so it'll be easier for me later on. Kitsuki chuckled. About time you got around to it. You've got to be the only damn one in our grade that didn't want to be a hero up until now. Well, you better watch yourself because I'm gonna be the next #1 hero. Oh, well that won't be a problem, I want to be a support hero. Kitsuki froze in place, his face cartoonishly stricken wide in bewilderment. After a moment, he ran up to Izuku, grabbed his collar, and then started shaking him. What the fuck do you mean support hero? Izuku, starting to get dizzy, sputtered out. Well, I'd be no good in a fight, so I thought that I'd be more useful as a support hero. Kitsuki let go of Izuku, who landed on his butt and continued to yell at him. No good in a fight. Your quirk's most useful in a fight, you dipshit. Izuku scooted away from his friend and spoke in a softer tone while looking away, trying to calm the situation down. Well yeah, but I don't have the confidence to fight as All Might does. I'm not as scared as I used to be since you introduced me to heroes, but I haven't got half the courage I need to actually save people. I'd be more useful helping the heroes that do the saving. Kitsuki sighed in frustration, walked up to Izuku, and held out his hand so he could grab it and get pulled up. After getting him up, Kitsuki grabbed Izuku's shoulder and looked directly into the lens of his sunglasses, making the greenette in question shrink back in fear. Listen here, Izuku. People like you and me can't squander our quirks being fucking support heroes. Now, what I'm about to tell you, I'll only ever tell you once. If you ever tell anybody I told you what I'm about to say, I'll deny it, got it? Izuku stood still for a short while, processing what his friend had just told him and how he should respond. Okay. I mean, yeah, I got it. Kitsuki closed his eyes and took in a deep breath. You've got a strong-ass quirk, Izuku, so don't you dare let your fear control you, got it? If you do, I'll never forgive you. Izuku was surprised, to say the least. He liked Kitsuki and he liked playing with him, but even he saw how much of a hothead he could be. He didn't know if he could remember a single time when Kachan had ever actually complimented him. If anything, he had only ever complimented himself, always boasting about how strong his quirk was and still is, and how he would become the next big shot hero. So, for Kitsuki to say something nice to him for a change was a jarring experience for Izuku. Promise me now, Izuku, promise me that when we're older we'll both aim to be the next #1 hero. Kitsuki said while jostling Izuku in his grip. Shaken out of his train of thought by his friend's demand, Izuku grabbed onto Kitsuki's arm with newfound vigor, stopping his friend shouting as he stared at the arm now on his own. I promise on my life, Kachan, I'll get over my fear and we'll both aim for #1. Izuku said, now with a louder volume and a fiery resolve in his voice. Kitsuki didn't respond, which made Izuku start to sweat. Had he said something wrong? Izuku faced away from the blonde and started to apologize, but before he could finish his sentence, Kitsuki put his arm around Izuku's neck, forming a deadlock, and brought it down so he could give him a noogie. Ahaha, you're damn right you fucking nerd. Anything else and I really would have killed you. Ow. You said you wouldn't do that again, Kachan. Well, I lied, what are you gonna do about it? The years came and went, both Izuku and Kitsuki were now 14 years old and students at Aldera Junior High. Inko had been right to be worried, school had been a painful drag for Izuku. Predictably, Izuku had made no friends in kindergarten. Kitsuki was the only kid who would play and hang out with him. When he entered kindergarten, Izuku was able to function only if he was left alone, and not much attention was brought to him. The teachers had been made aware of his condition, and they in turn informed Izuku's other classmates on how to interact with him before he was introduced to the class. Unfortunately, there would still be times when one person too many glanced or stared at Izuku, sending him into a fit of incoherent sobs and babbles about being stared at, forcing the teacher to have to pull Izuku away from the class to calm him down. Luckily, through more therapy sessions with Dr. Sugimoto and experience, Izuku was able to learn how to better manage his fear, and by the time he entered Aldera, his breakdowns became few and far between, as long as the medical mask and sunglasses that now donned his face nearly 24/7 hid it from the world around him. This, however, did nothing to help his social life. Izuku's pale and thin looks as well as his long bony fingers, which were the only part of him that was not hidden under clothing or facial wear and were often compared to creepy crooked tree branches, made people feel uncomfortable and as a result, no one would ever try to approach him. The reputation of his breakdowns that carried over to Aldera via the people that used to be in Izuku's classes did nothing to help settle people's distaste for him either. Katsuki, having spent considerable time with Izuku during their childhoods, did not mind how Izuku looked, and his face coverings had become normal to him. This, like in kindergarten, made Katsuki Izuku's only friend at school, and unfortunately, that fact did not come without any downsides for Katsuki. Everybody in their class had steered clear of him too, merely based on his relationship with the creepy green-haired shy guy. This avoidance of him had made Katsuki quite bitter toward his classmates. He didn't think they were even in the same league as him, so who were they to neglect his existence? Everybody in kindergarten had praised him and his quirk when he first developed it, so were they trying to insult him? Were they trying to insinuate that he wasn't worth their time? This bitterness kept growing within Katsuki, causing him to get into numerous verbal and physical fights with other students. Izuku would always try to pull his friend away when he started fights, to convince him that they weren't worth the trouble, but Katsuki rarely listened to Izuku's voice of reason. Izuku was far more passive than his friend, even when his classmates had started avoiding him less and started getting meaner and meaner, often making fun of the way he looked. He never talked back or tried to retaliate, he only cowered away from them and would ask them to leave him alone or to stop looking at him. Often Katsuki would have to intervene and threaten them to fuck off before he blasted them to pieces. After defending him, however, Katsuki would always chastise Izuku for not standing up for himself, stating that if he ever wanted to save anybody, he was going to have to learn how to save himself first, and that until then, he had no chance at all at becoming a hero. They wouldn't talk to each other much for a while after such an incident. Izuku never rose his hand or his voice towards his classmates, not once. Even though Izuku had spent a considerable amount of time in therapy with Dr. Sugimoto, he was still petrified at the possibility of someone mistakenly viewing his face, and so, he never fought back in fear that it might escalate the situation and allow his bullies to see his face uncovered, on purpose or not. And so the cycle went. Izuku would stick to Katsuki or himself. He would eventually be bothered by one of his classmates, trying to get a rise out of him. Most of the time his classmate with a quirk that gave him wings and another one with a quirk that allowed him to extend his fingers would work together to pester him. Strength in numbers, Izuku had guessed. Izuku would plead with them to leave him alone and to not stare at him. His bullies wouldn't let up. And then either Katsuki would threaten them and they'd start a fight, or Izuku would take his bullies' punishment until they got bored and left him alone once more. This cycle had become routine for Izuku, day in and day out, a routine he never dared to try to break. Unfortunately, that routine would come to be broken on what would be the worst day of Izuku's life. Izuku woke up in a cold sweat. He had the nightmare again. For a while now, about a year he'd say, he had been having a recurring nightmare every few nights. It would always start with him lost in a thick white fog and with the sound of someone crying in the distance. The sobbing would sound high-pitched, similar to that of a young child. He would move through the fog, somehow getting closer to the crying, no matter what direction he took. Eventually, he would reach a clearing. The ground there was reflective like a calm pond, and the sky was stark white. He would often look down to see his face's reflection, but would turn away, ashamed at the way he looked. After that, he would move on to the middle of the clearing where a tall dead oak tree awaited him. He could hear that the crying originated from behind the tree, and so he would try to walk around it to see who it was that was crying to satisfy his curiosity. But every time he did, the world would suddenly fade to a deep gray, and the voices he would often hear would start whispering unintelligible things to him before devolving into cries, yelps, and screams. After a moment, the voices would all suddenly go silent and he would notice that the crying had stopped too. Then, whoever was crying would let out a piercing yell which would knock Izuku onto his backside. Completely terrified, he would quickly scramble to get up, turn around and run as fast as he possibly could away from the clearing, the things yelling getting weaker and weaker as he got further. After a long time, Izuku would collapse onto the ground, exhausted, but then he would hear the yelling faintly, this time accompanied by loud thumping footsteps, getting closer and closer to him. Izuku would try to scurry away from whatever was coming, but each time it was no use, the thing would get closer and closer to him, and then he would wake up. It was the same thing time and time again. The nightmare would often make him lose sleep, and as a result, he'd be tired and groggy the entire rest of his day. Luckily, it seemed as if this time the nightmare had woken him up on time, and so, after wiping the sweat off of his forehead, Izuku sat up on his bed, wiped the tiredness out of his eyes, turned his alarm off, and got off of his bed. After getting up, Izuku grabbed his sunglasses off of his dresser, a new mask out of a disposable medical mask box that he had set next to where he would usually put his sunglasses, and put both of them on. It was the very first thing he would do every morning when getting up. He refused to leave his room without them. After putting on his school uniform, Izuku went to his door, unlocked it, unhooked the latch that had been screwed onto it, and then finally walked out of his room to go to the bathroom and do his morning routine. After freshening himself up, Izuku walked out to the kitchen to see his mom still in her pajamas, making breakfast. "Hi, Mom. What are you making?" Oh, good morning, honey. I'm making the usual rice, miso soup, and boiled vegetables. Well, it smells good. Though I won't be having much, I'm not that hungry. Inko frowned and put her hand on her hip. Izuku. You're never that hungry because of your quirk, and you know that. Not being bothered by pain is good and all, but that means you can ignore what your body tells you it needs. You need to eat a square breakfast every day. Izuku groaned softly. But mom. Izuku said, in a whine, no matter what I eat my body stays the way it is, do I really have to eat so much? It's always a drag. Yes, Izuku, food doesn't change your body, but nothing about your body makes sense. I don't want you to take the chance of not eating a lot and it making your condition worse. Remember what Dr. Sugimoto said, better. Izuku cut his mom off before she could continue. Safe than sorry. Yeah, I know he's right, it just gets tiring after a while. I know it's hard for you, but please put as much effort into it as you can, okay? I care for you so much, and I would hate to see you sick because you undereat. I know mom, thank you. Okay, I'll get a bowl of each, please. Good, I'll get it for you. Inko made Izuku's breakfast, handed it to him, and then sat across from him on the table to eat her breakfast. So, did you sleep well? Did you have that nightmare again? It's been a couple of days since the last one you had. Yeah, to both I mean. I had the dream again, but luckily it didn't wake me up in the middle of the night like last time, it woke me up right on time, right as my alarm was ringing. It makes me feel good, you know. Like, maybe today's gonna be a lucky day. Inko chuckled and smiled at her son. I'm sure it will be, Izuku. Izuku finished his breakfast, went to the vestibule to put his shoes on, and then finally left his house for school. Arriving at Aldera High's entrance, Izuku slightly shrunk and shuddered at the glances and stares he would get from some of the people who would pass, the occasional whispering after seeing him also wasn't appreciated. That's how it was every day for him, he hated his reputation, maybe if he had more friends, he'd seem more normal, and then people wouldn't stare at him so much. Yet again, that would mean he would have to deal with people staring at him for long periods. He had been able to learn how to not freak out when people would do so thanks to his doctor, but it still felt nowhere near comfortable when someone did. The only stares he felt comfortable under were Kitsuki's, his mom's, Dr. Sugimoto's, and his auntie Mitsuki's. After a bit of walking, Izuku entered his classroom and spotted his friend Kitsuki sitting at his desk with his feet thrown on top of it, seemingly in thought. Izuku admired Kitsuki quite a bit, he had always felt safe around him, Kitsuki was strong, and the most determined person Izuku had ever seen, with him around, although he could be quite crass and mean, he didn't feel as scared as he was otherwise. He didn't think he matched up to him, really, his quirk was strong, for sure, and regeneration is quite useful. There wasn't any wound Izuku had ever gotten that he didn't heal from in a few minutes, but Kitsuki's quirk was simply far more offensive than his. He thought that he might have had a chance if the strength boost part of his quirk ended up being real, but it wasn't. Izuku had gotten an appointment with Dr. Sugimoto in his childhood to see if he did get stronger when people saw his face, but it didn't end up happening. They tested it out, Izuku allowed Sugimoto to look at his face for a few seconds, but no dice, his strength didn't change a single bit while under his doctor's gaze, and Izuku didn't feel comfortable allowing him to view his face any longer than they did in the test, so they didn't take it any further. They determined that what must have happened was that, after Kitsuki viewed his face, Izuku was so stricken with fear that he had a rush of adrenaline that gave him hysteric strength. So all Izuku had was regeneration and high pain tolerance, sure he could get hurt and survive it, but if he went up against a tough villain, he wouldn't be able to do anything to help at all. Itsuki could, his proficiency with his quirk and how fast he had acquired it was truly remarkable, even to Izuku it was quite amazing, and he had a front row seat to his progression. Often, Kitsuki would ask his friend to spar with him, he liked fighting with Izuku because he could push the limits of his quirk since any damage Izuku could ignore and allow his quirk to heal, although admittedly the duo did go too far on some occasions, more than once, which is already more times than anybody should in their entire life, they had to scramble to find a way to hide the fact that Izuku had a gaping hole in both his shirt and his lower belly region. Both of them were heavily scolded and grounded by their respective moms each time they would pull such a stunt. Reaching his friend's desk, Izuku spoke up to greet Kitsuki. Good morning Kachan, how are you today? Snapping himself out of his train of thought, he greeted Izuku back. Huh? Oh, hey Izuku, I'm good, I guess. These fucking extras are still throwing me dirty looks and it's starting to piss me off. Izuku sweat dropped. You always say that. You should just let it go, they'll have to stop eventually. Itsuki scoffed, slammed his feet back to the ground, and raised his voice. The hell with that. I'll teach them to stay in their fucking league, those lame excuses for future hero wannabes. Izuku sighed, he knew Kitsuki was riling himself up and he'd probably get into a fight with someone who didn't appreciate his harsh words soon if he continued. Anyways. How was your? Izuku vocally paused for a moment, extending his pronunciation, trying to think of what to say to take Kitsuki's attention away so he wouldn't cause a scuffle. Sleep. How was your sleep? Kitsuki, shaken out of his potential rant, looked at his friend quizzically. By sleep? Why would you want to know that out of nowhere? Izuku stammered. Well, you see, it's just, well, I had that nightmare again last night, but it didn't wake me up in the middle of the night, so I was able to get a good night's rest, and I wanted to know if you slept well too. Kitsuki hummed in acknowledgement and then leaned back in his chair once again with his eyes closed, his arms supporting his head. Right, it's been a while since you've had one of those, I was wondering when it was gonna happen again. You need to get that fixed, you won't be able to study well and become a hero if you can't get a good night's fucking rest regularly. Izuku chuckled. Believe me, I'm trying, Kitsuki, I've talked about it a lot with my doctor and we're trying to find a way to make them stop, but so far nothing's worked. Kitsuki opened his eyes and gave Izuku a hard glare. Well, try harder. If your grades drop because of your damn cowardice, I'm gonna kick your ass. Izuku internally sighed to himself, it wasn't because he was a coward that he'd been having that nightmare. He'd always been scared and he's had plenty of nightmares before, of course, and yet he's never had a recurring one until recently. The one he had been having was different, most notably its reoccurrence, of course, but it was more so because he couldn't understand it. Most of the time he knew what his nightmares related to, whether it be something that scared him during the day or his phobia. The worst ones always were when he would dream of people looking at his face judgmentally, without him being able to do anything to stop them, but this one he couldn't tell where it came from. He'd never seen the place he would dream of, it felt exceedingly abstract, the type of tree he had never seen. The fogginess of it, the person who was behind the tree, it was all a mystery to him, it just started appearing one day without reason or cause. He told himself that it was probably his condition that was at fault for giving him these nightmares, but its nature didn't allow him to conclusively know if that was true, so the mystery remained. Before the two friends could continue their talk, they heard the bell sounding at the start of the school day. Pushing his sunglasses back into place on his nose, Izuku told Kitsuki that he had to sit down for class and that they'd talk some more during their break, after which he walked to his desk and did so, waiting for their teacher to finally arrive and start the class. Before long, the class had ended and after that, lunch, until finally the last class of the day had ended and Izuku sat alone in the classroom after most students had already left. Izuku was quickly scrolling through his phone, hopping from news article to news article and from video to video. He had missed a villain attack that morning and wanted to get any information he could get his hands on about this new up-and-coming hero, Mount Lady, and her quirk so he could write it down into his 13th quirk analysis for the future book. He had already cursed his phobia when he had learned that he had missed out on the battle between the villain and the gigantification quirked hero that happened on the path one would normally take to get from his home to his school. He had always opted to use lesser-known paths, ducking into alleyways and taking detours to get to school as to limit the number of people that would have a chance to look at him on his way to school. Knowing that catching up on the event and writing all of his analysis down would take a while, Izuku had told Kitsuki not to wait for him, that he would hang around a while longer after school to finish his analysis before he went home, and so Izuku sat there alone in the empty classroom, scribbling down onto his notebook until he was interrupted by a hand smashing down onto his desk. Jolting up, Izuku saw his two most persistent tormentors smiling venomously down at him like hyenas. "Hey Midoriya, funny seeing you here." The one to the left said mockingly, "How about we have a little talk?" The one to the right snickered. "Yeah, I think that's a good idea." It had all happened so fast, it felt as if everything was fuzzy, a blur, to him. Izuku slowly started to get a hold of his senses and realized he was standing in the empty classroom he stayed back in to catch up on that day's villain attack. He groggily looked around and then recoiled in horror at what surrounded him. The room was a chaotic mess. The walls had portions of it that seemed to be caving in, other portions had holes in them that he could easily peer through, and chairs and desks were thrown about everywhere haphazardly, as if a hurricane had passed through the room. Most horrifying of all, however, was the blood splattered everywhere and on everything. Izuku looked around in pure horror and disgust at all the scarlet splatter around him, but stopped once he laid eyes on his bullies' bodies. The one with a finger extension Quirk's face was almost caved in, his nose bent in an awkward, unnatural way, he was missing a few fingers, all of them laying every which way around the room, and his right arm seemed to be broken, snapped at an awkward angle. The other bully had it better off, all things considered. One of his wings had been ripped off of his back, his jaw seemed dislocated, and his ribs seemed to have been broken as well. Izuku nearly threw up at the sight. What had happened? Why had this happened? What was going on? Izuku moved towards the bodies and reached towards them to see if they were still conscious, only to see that his hands were covered and dripping with blood. Screaming in shock, Izuku fell onto his rear end and took notice that his clothes too were covered in crimson splatter. Izuku started frantically and heavily breathing, trying to get a hold of himself and regain his composure. Calm down, Izuku, happy thoughts, happy thoughts. Unzipping his bag, Izuku quickly pulled out his phone and scrambled to open it to call for an ambulance, all the while smudging his screen with the blood still on his hands. Finishing his call with the authorities, Izuku hoisted himself up with the help of a nearby, still standing, desk. Standing up fully, Izuku stared at his hands without moving for what seemed like forever, staring at the blood still dripping slowly onto the floor, still coating his hands like some nightmarish crimson glove. Before he knew it, Izuku was running out of Aldera and into the streets, taking the secretive paths he would normally take to avoid people's stares. He ran fast, faster, and even faster, faster than he ever thought he was physically capable of until he arrived under an overpass with nobody around. Finally slowing down, Izuku sat down on the ground, his back against the overpass's wall, stared at his hands once again and started sobbing, eventually turning into full-out crying. "Oh God, what did I do?" He put his hands under his sunglasses and over his eyes, crying onto them. I can't remember, why can't I remember?" Izuku remained there for a time, crying his eyes out and occasionally sniffling. A sour grate shot up from the ground not too far away from Izuku, and a blob of swamp greenish slime or sludge came out from the sewers to which the hole led to. The amorphous blob then formed jaws, teeth, and finally yellow sickly looking eyes. God damn it, didn't expect that freak of nature to be around. Okay, I need to find a skin suit so I can get away without him noticing. Looking around, the viscous villain spotted Izuku sitting down on the ground. He smiled at his apparent luck and made a dash toward Izuku, meaning to take control of his body, only for him to stop dead in his tracks once he had a better look at the young student in front of him. Now in a clearer light, the villain could now properly see the blood which was splattered all over Izuku's person and soaked his hands. He could smell a distinct smell in the air, similar to rusted iron, which somehow made his non-existent spine shiver in disgust. The villain finally narrowed his eyes and then spoke to Izuku in a brash tone while looming over him. Jesus Christ, kid, did you kill someone? Izuku, to the annoyance of the villain, didn't respond to his tormentor and only continued crying his eyes out, seemingly not having heard the question posed to him. The sludge villain hesitated for a few moments. Should he take over the body of the mess before him, then the blood would almost immediately get him noticed, defeating the very purpose of the disguise in the first place, but then an idea came to him, an evil idea. The villain smiled like a hungry wolf and approached Izuku even closer, his face now directly in front of the greenette's own, and whispered to him. I'm right, aren't I? You murdered someone. Izuku's crying stopped dead as soon as the slime villain ended his phrase. Seeing that he was getting the desired effect, the slime villain raised himself back up and uproariously laughed, seemingly in glee at the revelation. Ahahaha. Ah, so you're a little up-and-coming villain, aren't ya? My, we're practically brothers. The villain threw his face back in laughter before suddenly getting up close to Izuku once again. How did it feel, huh? By the looks of it you weren't cold and clean about it, how did it make you feel to take someone's life? Did you enjoy their screams as you beat them? Did you relish in their pain as they begged you to stop? Did you? Izuku only trembled in response, still not looking at the villain, but clearly hearing what was being said to him. The villain flashed a toothy smile and continued. See, we're the same, you and I, we don't care about others, we just take what we want, people's lives included. Izuku now was trembling like a leaf and blubbered incoherently while crying as hard as he could. And people like us, we have to stick together, help each other out, no? So why don't you give me a hand? The villain finished his speech and violently grabbed Izuku's body, propping him up so Izuku was standing and facing toward the hole from which he had come. The villain thanked his lucky stars as a familiar blonde-haired muscular man burst from sewers, uproariously yelling out. Have no fear, for I am here. After getting himself behind Izuku, he turned himself slightly towards the greenette while carefully watching All Might and spoke, loud enough so that the blonde hero could hear what he had said. Well, there he is, my fellow colleague, thank you for taking the fall for me. The sludge-quirked villain turned and ran away with a smirk while laughing and yelling out that he wished Izuku luck in his future endeavors once he got out of prison. All Might's luck was just horrible that day. Not only had a villain appeared out of nowhere and stolen a lady's money while he was shopping and low on steam, but now he had a tall person in front of him who seemed to be taking the fall for the villain he was chasing. He couldn't exactly pinpoint the age of the person in front of him, he was smaller than him, but not by that wide of a margin, and he wore some quite baggy clothes, so it made estimating their age difficult. Blood was splattered everywhere on his person, he had face coverings which hid his identity, and he seemed to be shaking and crying, clearly in emotional distress. All Might pondered for a moment, what should he do in this situation? Should he go after the villain he was chasing before, or should he assume that the villain was in fact truthful and the person in front of him was a villain who had just killed someone? Villains had broken down in front of him before, so it could explain this person's emotional state, but the tall stranger could have been part of a horrible accident and simply been in shock. The villain could have taken advantage of that to use this person as bait. He needed more information, so he tried to look closer, and thankfully taking his time proved useful. He felt something familiar in the pants that the stranger was wearing. Then he remembered that a school, one decently far from where they were now, had a Gakurin uniform that students were made to wear. He remembered commonly seeing students around the area wearing the uniform while he was out on patrol near the school. The student in front of him seemed to be lacking the top part of the uniform, or at least had it concealed underneath his hoodie, but the dark-colored pants were unmistakable. All Might pulled out his phone and checked the time before putting his eyes back on the person in front of him. It was right around the time when most school days ended, so the blood-covered student must have been in class not too long ago. Thing is, there's no way someone could have made it here in such a short amount of time, at least not without a speed quirk, that is. Then, All Might finally started to make the connection: the blood, the crying, the shaking, the distance between here and the school. He couldn't know for certain, but it looked more and more like this student had been a late bloomer, or at the very least, did not know how to properly use his quirk and as a result, accidentally rendered someone into a paste in the excitement of using his speed quirk. He had seen it far too many times: young people who didn't know any better and possessed a powerful quirk, losing control of said quirk or using it recklessly, resulting in a tragic loss of life. It was a depressing thing to witness. Worst of all were the faces that the kids would have after the fact when the reality of taking someone's life started to set in. It was a look similar to that of shell shock. A 1,000-mile stare coupled with tremors, sometimes accompanied by confusion or disbelief, sometimes both. All of these seemed to be present in the person before him. He couldn't see in what direction his eyes were pointed, but his head didn't move, his hands were shaking, and he was blabbering incoherently to himself. All Might tightened his fist and cursed under his breath. The sludge villain must have gotten quite a distance away by now. It would take him quite a bit of effort to catch up to him, but he just couldn't leave this emotionally vulnerable kid in front of him alone, not after what he must have just been through recently, judging by the freshness of the blood on him. All Might grabbed his phone once again and dialed 911. "Hello, this is All Might. There is a child in need of help at my current location. I am chasing a dangerous villain and cannot stay around to help him. Send help now. I will leave my phone on the scene so it can be tracked, thank you." All Might threw his phone to the side. Hopefully the police would arrive quickly and get this troubled kid the help he needs. Before leaving and chasing after the villain, however, All Might felt he needed to say something, anything, so that the shaking Izuku could feel at least a little bit more stable until the authorities arrived. All Might attempted to walk forward, but something stopped him from doing so. The feeling deep in his gut arose and kept on building as he stared at the lanky frame of the crying, babbling figure in front of him, a feeling he had learned to suppress probably better than any other, but that was for some unknown reason being unleashed upon him in progressively mightier and mightier waves. All Might started sweating. He felt fear, true dread and anxiety as he stared at Izuku, and as he kept his gaze on the greenet, he swore he could hear things originating from all around him, screams and yells of pain and anger, as well as what sounded like the groaning of a dying animal. Yet, as fast as it had arrived, it was gone the next moment. All Might had closed his eyes and breathed out, trying to regain control of his senses, and everything had gone back to normal. He stood still for a moment and looked around, trying to see if he had truly heard what he had heard, but found nothing. All Might questioned his sanity for a moment, but shook himself out of his train of thought and faced Izuku once again. He had a job to do. Steeling his resolve, All Might walked forward and calmly, as to not startle Izuku, spoke to him. "Young man, do not worry. I know you are not a villain. I don't know what happened that led you to where you are now, but I know one thing for sure, and that's that everything will be okay. You know why? Because I am here, and I will make sure that you get the help that you need." All Might was now an arm's length away from Izuku. The bloody greenet's babbles had gradually quieted, then stopped, and his shaking had lessened. He now only wept softly into his hands that were plastered to his face. Seeing that his words had a positive effect on Izuku, All Might breathed out a slight sigh of relief. "I need to go now, that villain is still loose, and it's a hero's job to make sure that villains don't get away to hurt more people. I've called the police, they'll be arriving shortly to get you to a hospital, there your parents will be called, and a psychologist will be on call if you need one. You can call for me once you feel better, I'll be more than happy to help in any way that I can." Izuku continued weeping into his hands. Deciding that he'd done good enough, All Might went to walk by Izuku to go after the runaway villain once again, but he was stopped by the tall student suddenly grabbing his arm before he could get past him. Izuku stayed still, one hand grabbing All Might's arm and the other still on his face. He spoke to All Might almost in a whisper, his voice now dry and coarse from all the crying he'd done. "Thank you." Izuku let go of All Might and resumed his weeping. The hero looked back and stared at Izuku for a brief moment before shaking himself out of his trance and facing towards the outside of the overpass once again. All Might crouched down to jump away after the sludge villain and turned back one last time to wish Izuku good luck before shooting off, unintentionally hitting Izuku with a strong gust of wind. Izuku remained under the underpass, quietly lamenting and crying into his scarlet-colored hands for a painfully long amount of time, luckily having no one come across him during the time he remained there. Eventually, an officer arrived at the underpass in a police cruiser. He hopped out at a brisk pace and briefly looked around until his eyes landed on Izuku and his sniveling form. When the call arrived at the police station, they were a small bit uncertain as to who to send to the scene. All Might had said that a child needed help, but he hadn't specified what kind of help was needed. They did not know if the child mentioned needed medical care and needed an ambulance, or if they were trapped and needed the help of the fire department. They were in the dark about the situation. Ultimately, the station deemed it wise to send in an officer first to assess the situation. Once at the scene, they would be able to communicate what kind of help was needed and request for it to be sent to the location to help the child in need. The officer sent to the scene was a new recruit on his first week as a police officer, Officer Chikao Takahashi. First, it was 2 students at Aldera, and now this Chikao had thought to himself when he took the call, he had heard about it over the police radio channel. 2 young teenagers maimed and mutilated half to death. He felt thankful he never chose to become an ambulance driver or a nurse. He didn't think he would have been able to stand seeing people so young be so viciously injured. During his drive, he prayed that the kid that he was sent to help wasn't like the previous 2 and was in a better condition. He actually felt relieved for a moment when he first laid his eyes on Izuku's form, but his stomach sank once he came closer, had a better look at him, and smelled the foul rusted iron-like smell in the air. Chikao recoiled at Izuku's appearance and nearly yelped out in shock, but he quickly recovered, his training kicking in, and approached the weeping teenager at a brisk pace, stopping a few meters away from him. "Hey, kid. I'm a police officer, how are you feeling, what do you need?" Izuku didn't respond, he only continued crying, much to the confusion of the officer. "Are you alright? Are you injured? Do you need an ambulance?" Still, Izuku didn't respond. Chikao hesitated for a few moments, then pulled out his flashlight to see better and got closer to Izuku, examining him. He saw no obvious injury on Izuku, no sign that the blood on him was his, he was standing up perfectly fine and didn't seem to be bleeding at all. Chikao stopped examining Izuku and thought for a moment, if the blood wasn't his, then where had it come from? "If you can hear me, say something." Izuku didn't respond, just as Chikao had expected. Inspecting Izuku further, Chikao froze once he noticed the pants Izuku was wearing. His son went to Aldera, and so he recognized the black Gakurin uniform pants immediately. "No. It can't be." Chikao panned his flashlight up to Izuku's face, and he stared in horror. After a moment, however, Chikao started feeling bad for the kid. He was clearly in emotional distress. If he was related to the incident with those 2 students, he might have not meant for what happened to happen. Jesus Christ. Deciding he'd wasted too much time, Chikao turned around and finally radioed the police station. He described how Izuku didn't seem to need urgent medical attention, but that he was in considerable emotional distress and unresponsive to any attempts at communication. After a few moments of hesitation, Chikao also added how Izuku looked to be a student at Aldera and that he might be connected to the 2 students who were attacked not too long ago, considering the substantial amount of blood on the greenet. The radio went silent. Chikao gathered that the operator must have been shocked at his revelation. The operator spoke once again, asking if Chikao was certain. Chikao responded, detailing how his son went to Aldera and how he could recognize the school's uniform and that he wasn't certain for a fact, but that the evidence pointed towards the teenager being connected. The operator didn't respond for a few moments, taking their time to assess the situation. Finally, the operator told Chikao that the child would first have to be sent to the hospital. If they are too distraught to communicate, they would figure out their connection to the assault at the station later, once they'd calmed down. Chikao agreed and requested that he'd be the one to drive Izuku to the hospital. It'd be faster and wouldn't waste an ambulance on someone who doesn't urgently need it. The operator agreed with Chikao's reasoning and told him to do so. Turning back around to face Izuku, Chikao approached Izuku once again and put his hand behind his back, gently pushing him to guide him toward his cruiser. Izuku did not resist and slowly walked at the pace Chikao pushed, eventually arriving at the car's backseat door. Like before, Izuku wouldn't move on his own, and so Chikao set Izuku so he was facing away from the car, carefully pushed him so he'd sit down in the car, lifted his legs into the car, and then buckled him in. After closing the car's door, Chikao hopped into the driver's seat and finally set off for the closest hospital. On his way there, Chikao couldn't help but look back at Izuku and silently pray to God that he was wrong and that what happened wasn't the kid's fault. He couldn't bear to see such tragedy so early on in his career. Suddenly, Chikao was shaken by the sound of a huge explosion. In the distance, he could see a rising column of smoke not too far away from their location. His suspicion was confirmed when his radio sprung to life, announcing that all available units and heroes were needed at the place where Chikao had seen the smoke come from and that a hostage situation was underway. Chikao started sweating, he looked back at Izuku and debated what he should do. Damn it. Sorry, kid, but people might be dying. Putting his car into fourth gear, Chikao sped off to the scene, stopped a good distance behind a crowd of onlookers gawking at the scene, and hopped out of his car, running to the front of the crowd to help out the other officers already helping to contain the crowd. Izuku, for his part, didn't react to Chikao's sudden stop and departure, he only remained in the police car and continued to sob quietly to himself. At least until he heard the yell of a certain blonde live grenade, that is. Over all of the chaos, yelling, and explosions, one might have not been able to clearly hear Katsuki's voice through all the chaos, but once Izuku heard him, it was all his mind could focus on. Izuku stopped crying, slowly removed his hands from his eyes, and turned towards the window facing the crowd. Hachan. Izuku shifted closer toward the window, gripping the car door and plastering a hand on the glass, his bottom lip quivering. Hachan. Izuku started hyperventilating, his heart rate starting to pick up to a ridiculous rate. Hachan. Through the crowd, Izuku was finally able to get a glimpse at the sludge villain and Akatsuki suffocating in his grasp. Izuku's eyes went as wide as they could, he grimaced in anger, and finally his jaw practically unhinged, and he screamed as loud as his lungs would let him. Hachan. Izuku started pounding at the door to force it open, catching the attention of a few spectators who hung at the back of the crowd, eventually shattering the glass window by plunging his arm through it, slightly ripping his hoodie and skin, and embedding multiple shards of glass into his arm. After the window was no longer a problem, Izuku dug his fingers into the car door's steel body and pushed and pulled on it until it was completely ripped off its hinges. The few spectators became a small portion of the crowd, all watching in worry as Izuku went ballistic, and their worry soon became fear as they saw Izuku sprinting at them at breakneck speed with no sign of stopping. Some made it out of his way, but some either couldn't do it in time or hadn't picked up on the commotion behind them and as a result were either trampled underfoot or violently shoved to the side and onto the ground. Having made his way through the crowd, Izuku ran through two police officers who tried to halt his progress, dislocating their arms as he ran through them. The final obstacle before he'd set upon the sludge villain was before him, Death Arms. He had taken notice of the teen as he was breaking out of the police car and had steeled himself when he saw Izuku approaching the crowd rapidly with no plans of stopping. As Izuku got close to Death Arms, he snatched the young student up by wrapping his hands around his arms and lifting him up to prevent any further movement from Izuku. Izuku responded by flailing and shaking around, trying to get out of his vice grip. What the hell's wrong with you, kid? You might have just injured people and we really don't need that right in. Before Death Arms could finish his sentence, Izuku began forcing his way out of his grip, his sudden strength catching the pro hero off guard and making him sweat and curse under his breath. With one final strong push, Izuku wriggled himself out of the large man's trap and fell back to the floor, where he then brought his arm back and drove his hand into the pro hero's gut. Screaming at the top of his lungs, Death Arms grabbed Izuku's arm, pulled it out of himself, and then fell to one knee clutching at his wound. Izuku's assault did not let up, however, and as Death Arms looked back up from his wound and to Izuku once again, he only had a few moments to look at the teenager's horrifying red fist before it connected with his jaw and sent him flying into a nearby building, shaking the entire structure and severely damaging its integrity. Having gotten rid of his last obstacle, Izuku wasted no time and started sprinting toward the sludge villain while screaming like a madman, surprising both the villain and the hostage who now knew the identity of the newcomer, the former annoyed at his return and the latter confused and worried at his sudden appearance. Before the sludge villain could react, Izuku pounced a few meters away from the villain and threw himself into the villain's green mass, submerging himself completely. Both Katsuki and Mountain Lady, who had a good view of the ordeal, were shocked at Izuku's actions and worried he might suffocate. The sludge villain laughed and made snide remarks to Izuku, calling him an idiot. His laughs were quieted, however, when a blood and sludge-covered hand shot up from the gooey mass, grabbing the villain's still solid eye and crushing it in its grip, spewing blood everywhere and turning portions of the sludge villain's goo a more crimson color. The unfortunate villain screeched in pain and started flailing his mass around as his optic was compressed into a pulp, trying to rid himself of his attacker, all the while using Katsuki's quirk to help him by throwing explosions in every which direction, causing more structural damage to the area, creating more fires, and kicking up a large amount of dust and debris. The building that Death Arms had been thrown into was hit by more and more explosions. It shook, harder, and even harder still. Concrete and rebar started to crumble and fall to the street below. Eventually, the now fragile structural integrity of the building could not hold on any longer, and the portion of the building that the punching hero had crashed into collapsed, completely blocking the side of the street that it was on with an imposing wall of debris and preventing anyone that was on the other side to be able to see anything of what was happening beyond it. The villain still continued to cry and howl in pain as whatever solid thing Izuku could get his hands on was ripped and torn from the pile of sludge that he was submerged in. The pile of green and red slime kept throwing explosions around willy-nilly until finally through the haze of pain and confusion, he finally had a brief moment of focus. Shifting his mass away from Izuku's upper chest, the villain revealed Izuku's form, who came out yelling and screaming while flailing his arms around like a screeching lunatic, trying to grasp at whatever was around him and painfully forced Katsuki's hand towards Izuku's head, unleashing a point-blank explosion at the teen's face. Katsuki could only watch in horror as his hand was forced to attack his friend. Izuku had survived wounds that normally would have been fatal before. Katsuki knew that from the roughhousing they'd partake in during their sparring sessions. He had become desensitized to Izuku sporting a gaping hole in his body. He'd always regenerated anyway, so he'd never have anything to worry about but losing his head. Even someone with a quirk like Izuku's couldn't possibly be able to survive that, no way. Katsuki's mouth had been uncovered in the villain's panic and so he was able to breathe, but he did not utter a single word or scream at the villain. He waited on bated breath for the smoke caused by the villain, forcing him to use his quirk to clear to see if Izuku survived the hit he suffered. Mountain Lady too anxiously waited on a positive reveal. She had not been able to see anything because of the cloud of smoke and dust that the villain had caused, but she had well enough heard all of the ordeal starting from when Izuku had hurled himself at the sludge villain. She had heard the sound of the villain's pain and of the ripping and tearing on Izuku's part after one more delayed explosion, however, it was radio silence. It was faint over all of the chaos, but Mountain Lady could make out the sound of something falling to the ground after the explosion and then sliding a short distance before stopping. She only had to make the logical connection to figure out what had happened inside the cloud. Was that brat alive? Was he dead? She and Katsuki could only wait to find out. Izuku awoke lying on the ground in a haze of confusion. He could feel that his head hurt. He didn't feel any pain thanks to his quirk, but he was aware that something was wrong with it and so he reached towards it instinctively to try to find out what was wrong with it. Except, when he arrived to touch his forehead, he did not feel skin, nor flesh at all for that matter. Izuku could only feel a hard, solid surface when his fingers reached their intended destination. Izuku frantically touched around to see if the rest of his head felt the same, and to his horror, it did. Izuku started hyperventilating. He tried to open his eyes, but yet when he did, nothing at all, nothing but a black void of nothingness presented itself to him. Izuku's anxiety rose and rose as his hands explored more of his charred head and face, as his hands tugged at the last remaining shreds of his hair. Izuku got up while still touching his face. Despite how worried he was at his lack of vision and his injured head, there was still one thing he was worried about above all. His face. He didn't have his medical mask or his sunglasses. He needed to get out of wherever he was before it was too late and someone caught a glimpse at his face. He couldn't allow it to happen. Suddenly, however, a dim light appeared in his vision which slowly increased as the seconds passed and eventually he was finally able to make out his surroundings through a small hole in his recovering vision. Izuku looked around, trying to find where he was, but was unable to gain any useful information. Izuku was unable to see properly, even with his vision almost completely restored. The smoke and dust in the air made it impossible for him to see further than a meter in front of him. Izuku was about to start walking aimlessly around to try to find his way, but then he realized that the dust was starting to settle slightly, so he decided to take the risk of waiting. Maybe if there was anyone around, he could see them before they see him and be able to make a quick escape, he told himself. Unfortunately, that would not come to pass, for as the smoke and dust cleared, Izuku was left face to face with the sludge villain whom he had attacked staring daggers at him. Immediately, everything froze as Izuku peered into the villain's eyes. A foul dark feeling took a hold of his entire body, and like a distant forgotten memory, he was met with a dark world and those awful, staring eyes. He felt dread and terror consume his entire being as the oppressive aura of the eyes kept hammering and hammering away at his very soul. He fell to his knees, covered the back of his head with his hands, and pleaded to be let go, to be released, for his torment to stop, but no amount of begging did him any good. Then, like all those years ago with Katsuki when they had met, a long-forgotten emotion arose within Izuku like a fiery raging inferno. Anger, pure rage and hatred, these emotions were swirling and building within Izuku, with ever-growing and unstoppable intensity. At a certain point, Izuku started hearing voices yelling at him louder and louder. They kept increasing in volume, making Izuku scrape the back of his neck with his fingers, drawing blood and tearing at his skin. Izuku couldn't take it anymore, his rage reached a boiling point and he shot up from his spot on the ground and unleashed a titanic roar. Itsuki, Mountain Lady, and the crowd were all horrified at what was happening before them. Izuku had started screaming and babbling once again when the villain had caught a glimpse of his face, and unfortunately, that wasn't the end of it. At first, Izuku clasped his hands over his face and started waving his body around uncontrollably. After a minute or two, his body started to change, violently so. Izuku stopped yelling, gasped, and fell back down on all fours, his body trembling and shifting erratically. A sickening crunch could be heard, and Izuku resumed yelling, except instead of yells of distress and fear, this time Izuku let out a screech of torture. Izuku's bones started moving and shifting under his skin, and his body started expanding and being stretched. His fingers and toes were pierced by his phalanges, making him look like he was forming claws and destroying his shoes even further. Eventually, the entirety of his arms shot through his hands, making even more of a bloody spectacle. His chest region started expanding and expanding until his ribcage tore his chest open, making all of his entrails and organs fall out with a wet thud. Even his heart, still beating, struck the pavement. Izuku's limbs kept stretching and growing still, his humerus, femur, ulna, tibia, radius, and fibula all painfully ripping through his flesh, eventually making them wildly out of proportion with his body. As Izuku's transformation came to an end, he stopped screaming and writhing and shifted to whimpering. Most of the crowd had either turned away to not watch the torturous spectacle or had thrown up in the process of watching it. Mountain Lady herself had to bring up her hand to her mouth to prevent herself from hurling. Through the horror, however, they had a small moment of respite as they saw Izuku's quirk going to work. Parts of him his body no longer needed fell off him as if they had rotted, leaving way for his body to regenerate all that it had torn off of itself. All of his muscles, organs, and nerves grew back, and his skin started sewing itself back together. Eventually, the last bit of his skin was regenerated and Izuku was completely repaired. The horror had not ended, however, for with the end of Izuku's nightmare, the sludge villains had now truly begun. Izuku started hyperventilating, his breaths becoming shorter and shorter as Izuku raised his head to look at the huge green mass before him. His eyes had gone completely blank, no eyes were left at all, and he was grinding his teeth together in anger. Izuku stared at the sludge villain in abject loathing, his hatred became so palpable that the villain and the other onlookers had become able to physically feel it, making them recoil. Finally, Izuku's jaw unhinged wide, he let out a piercing guttural roar and he got up and ran at the villain. Namasa Tsukauchi sat at a desk going over pages and pages of information, accounts and data. Across from him and on the other side of a one-way glass sat Izuku Midoriya's stretched and warped form, quietly sobbing to himself in the corner of the room. Namasa was not a man to smoke, but this case had pushed him into taking up the habit. The whole situation just seemed like a pit of continuous and unending tragedy he'd never be able to pull himself out of. He had to find a way to unwind, even if it wasn't the healthiest things to get into, or else he'd lose his mind trying to get everything into order. Namasa took a long drag of his cigarette, held his breath for a moment, then breathed out, removing all of the smoke from his lungs. Finally, he put out his cigarette, leaving it on an ashtray on the desk, and got up determined to get anything out of the monster in the other room. The detective opened the door to the questioning room, and a pang of dread washed over him as his eyes fell on Izuku's warped form. He felt both sadness and anger for the green-haired student. He hadn't stopped crying for a single moment since the day he was brought to the station. He was distraught by what had happened, and Namasa knew that was true. His quirk didn't detect any trace of lying or subterfuge from Izuku. Those weren't crocodile tears he was crying, they were true, but yet this one person, this one kid was the single cause to many people's lives being lost. No official number had been given as of people's, the police were still trying to establish a timeline and organize everything, so no death toll had been given to the press, but more and more missing person reports were coming in, and it was becoming impossible to hold the media back. Namasa couldn't exactly blame the news outlets, even he could admit that this disaster was particularly bleak. It only made sense that the public would be afraid, paranoid, and demanding more info when a random person appeared seemingly out of nowhere and without warning, caused an untold amount of destruction to Musatafu and killed without remorse and without any apparent reason. Namasa was doing his best to make sense of the situation, but all he knew for sure now was how the incident started and how it ended. It had all started when another villain, one with a sludge quirk, took a teenager hostage. The situation then was already bad as it was, but it all went to hell when Izuku arrived. According to several eyewitness accounts, the first time Izuku was seen at the epicenter of the disaster was when he had busted out of a police cruiser that was present on the scene. Apparently he was manic, screaming non-stop while galloping towards the other villain with reckless abandon, disregarding anything and everything in his path. The people injured during his first appearance were the luckiest ones affected by his rampage. They had only been either trampled or violently shoved. The worst injuries suffered there were bruises, sprained ankles, or small bone fractures. After that came the first serious injury of the ordeal, Death Arms. Death Arms had narrowly escaped death. It was lucky that many civilians were present at the scene and had called for emergency medical help. When they had fished him out of piles of rubble and wreckage, his guts were threatening to spill out from him. He was somehow still semi-conscious, however, and was manually preventing them from leaking out from his abdomen. Once he and the paramedics had arrived to the hospital, they immediately put him into an intensive care unit where it took multiple tries until they finally got his condition stable. He had flatlined more than once until they finally succeeded. At the end of it all, Death Arms was left unable to walk because of multiple fractures to his legs, got a concussion that would need months of therapy to heal completely, was left suffering from a painful abdomen wound that would require surgery to correct and to stop being debilitatingly painful, and multiple deep gashes, cuts, broken bones and otherwise grave wounds all over his body. Naomasa continued looking at Izuku. One moment he was putting holes in heroes and then just as fast he becomes a crying mess. It didn't make any sense. Why would he feel bad now? Why did he not care about viciously attacking people then? Naomasa needed answers and he was going to get them. Naomasa advanced into the room and approached Izuku, eventually stopping a meter from him. "Are you ready to cooperate now?" Izuku continued sobbing in the corner, not helping his already damp medical mask. Naomasa sighed deeply, grabbed Izuku by the arm, dragging him to a chair and making him sit on it, and then went to the other side of the table he had sat Izuku at and sat down, taking out a file. "Let's try this again. What do you want? Why did you do this?" No response. Naomasa stared daggers at Izuku, making the teenager turn away from the detective. He stood up, slammed a document on the table, and tried to loom over Izuku, only succeeding in getting on an eye-to-eye level with him. You cleaved through a mile of concrete, metal pipes, and sediment like it was tissue paper. Hundreds, possibly thousands of civilians injured, who knows how many dead, a hero nearly dead, one villain unable to be located, and 3 rescue personnel whose bodies have been unable to be recovered. What happened down there? Why? What could they have possibly done to make you kill them for it? Once again, no response from Izuku. Exasperated, Naomasa picked up the document and went to exit the room in a huff, but before he could close the door, however, Izuku spoke in a deep, strained and gruff voice. "Face." Naomasa froze and looked back at Izuku. "They saw my face." Izuku resumed crying harder, and Naomasa gripped the door tightly, slamming it shut after a few seconds of staring at Izuku. Naomasa remained just in front of the door he had slammed shut for a moment, staring at it in a horrified trance, before quickly walking back to the adjacent room and taking out a cigarette from his pack of cigarettes and lighting it. His face. The people he attacked, the people he killed, they died because they saw his face. This was madness, insanity. It felt like Naomasa was living a waking nightmare. What twisted logic did that inhuman monster operate on that held death as an acceptable penalty for viewing his face? Naomasa took a long drag of his cigarette and breathed out. It was progress, but he was going to need more information than that if he was going to build a proper timeline and figure out how this all came to be in the first place. At the very least this explained how some things were triggered. Report said that Izuku was not as tall and stretched as he was now when he broke out of the police cruiser. It only happened once he got hit by the explosion quirk of the other villain's hostage's quirk. Apparently, once they were face to face, that's when Izuku's body started to change violently. Does that mean that viewing Izuku's face acts as a sort of trigger for his quirk? It would explain the shift in power, how he went from being able to tear flesh to being able to tear at stone, metal, and earth. It would also come to explain Izuku's uncanny ability of locational awareness. They had mapped out Izuku's path of destruction through the sewers. It admittedly looked erratic and random, twisting and turning one moment then going straight the other, busting into a wall, only to erupt out of it a few meters away. But the more that they compared where the sludge villain might have been at a certain time and what direction Izuku was going in at that same moment, the more they realized that no matter where the villain was, Izuku was always able to head directly towards him in a perfectly straight line. The thought was both sobering and horrifying to Naomasa. He thanked his lucky stars that All Might had told them not to remove Izuku's face coverings under any circumstance. He had told them it was to keep Izuku calm, that he was scopophobic, and that they made him feel safe, but had they ignored the warning or not respected All Might's wishes so they could ID Izuku, they'd likely all be dead. Naomasa sighed. Although some questions had been answered, new ones were popping up. If Izuku killed anyone that saw his face, why had the hostage not been killed? Witnesses claimed that when Izuku broke out of the police cruiser, he was wearing the same type of sunglasses and medical mask, therefore no one could have been able to see his face to trigger him, so what made him go ballistic to begin with? The detective opened a file marked Katsuki Bakugo. He had been the one taken hostage by the sludge villain not too long before the police cruiser that contained Izuku arrived on the scene. Just as the villain did, this Katsuki Bakugo must have seen Izuku's face too. He was right there in the middle of it with the other two, yet unlike all the others who had gazed upon his deadly face, he was alive, not unharmed, but very much alive, which is entirely remarkable considering the fact that the bodies of those who had seen Izuku's face had not even been able to be recovered yet. Katsuki Bakugo had been recovered by the rescue team at the start of the recovery effort. They had found him unconscious near the opening that Izuku had made into the sewers while attacking the sludge villain with a broken neck. Naomasa hypothesized that the villain had thrown Katsuki at Izuku in an attempt to buy himself some time while escaping through the sewers. That's when Izuku would have grabbed Katsuki by the throat, which would come to explain the broken neck. Katsuki should have died then and there, but instead, Izuku only held his throat tight enough to break it and strangle Katsuki until he eventually passed out, opting instead of killing Katsuki to give chase after the sludge villain. That was what the detective thought happened between Izuku and Katsuki. This stumped Naomasa. What was it about Katsuki that set him apart when it came to the other victims? He'd have to bring him in for questioning once he recovered enough from his injuries. It might give him a clue as to why Izuku would have spared this one person. Naomasa got up from his chair while taking another drag of his cigarette and pondered how he should proceed with the investigation. While pacing around the room, he decided he should give up questioning Izuku. He wasn't going to cooperate at all anytime soon, and it'd just end up being a waste of time. Instead, Naomasa decided that he should try interviewing witnesses to try to piece together the events that led up to Izuku being held in that police car, what happened in the sewers, and why they were unable to find the bodies of Izuku's confirmed victims. Before he could get far in his deliberating on who to question first, however, a knock came to the door. Snuffing out his cigarette in the ashtray, Naomasa walked to the door and opened it, revealing a police officer. "Sorry, sir, but the woman's back." Naomasa sighed. Izuku Midoriya, she was there the day they brought Izuku into custody, both at the scene of the end of Izuku's rampage and at the station. Once they brought him there, she'd been hounding them to let her see her son ever since, barely even leaving the station, until she was forced to when they eventually closed their doors for the night. They had to deny her request. They were still trying to get Izuku to talk, and with his mother's protection, he might have shut down completely and hid behind her, so they didn't want to take the chance. Now, however, Naomasa was reconsidering his decision. Maybe if Izuku was calmer than he was now, then maybe he'd be able to make progress. Maybe he'd been a fool and let his emotions cloud his judgment. No matter how monstrous he looked, no matter what heinous acts Izuku had committed, and no matter how angry he was at Izuku for having done what he did, Izuku was still only a kid who was scared and afraid out of his mind, who was vulnerable and was shutting down in response. Naomasa thanked the police officer, patted him on his shoulder, then advanced towards the reception area, where he came upon Inko yelling at the receptionist. "Let me see my son, for God's sake. It's been 3 days and I've waited long enough, let me see him goddammit." Naomasa approached the nervous receptionist and told her that he'd take care of it, gesturing for her to walk away so he could handle the situation. Izuku Midoriya. Inko, frustrated, breathed in to try to calm her anger. "Yes. That's me, please, can I see my son?" Naomasa shook his head. "No, not yet." Inko's anger flared up again, but before she could explode on Naomasa, he raised his hand up to stop her and spoke. "But that can change, I need to ask you a few questions." Inko hesitated for a few moments. "Am I being interrogated?" "Yes, I believe you might be able to help me in my investigation, and the faster I can figure out the details of how this incident happened and what happened in those sewers, the faster you'll be able to see your son." Inko sighed. "Fine, but only if you promise me I can see my son." Naomasa thought for a moment. "Fine, I promise, but it will only be for a certain amount of time, I won't allow you to stay with him overnight." "That's fine with me, as long as I can see him, I'll answer any question you have." "Very well. Please follow me." Naomasa allowed Inko behind the reception counter and further into the police station. Once at the cells, Inko could hear Izuku sobbing. It took everything she had not to run in to see her son. She just wanted to go in there and comfort him, to tell him that everything was okay, that he would be okay, and that she loved him, but she knew Naomasa would pull her away. She knew that the detective might go back on his promise, so she held on and kept walking behind him. Proceeding to the questioning room. Naomasa opened the door for Inko, who proceeded to sit down and lay her purse on the table, then went to sit down himself, pulling out a notepad and flipping a few papers until arriving on the desired page. Miss Midoriya, you're Izuku's mother, am I correct? Yes, I am. And you were there when All Might brought Izuku to us, correct? Inko looked to the side. I wasn't just there, I helped in saving my innocent son. Namasa closed his eyes in anger and laid the notepad on the table. Miss Midoriya, your son ran through a mile of stone, causing untold chaos on the streets above, and killed 3 people with his own hands, not counting those he might have killed as a result of the damage he caused to the city. Inko rose up and smashed her hand onto the table, shaking it and hurting her hand in the process. Seething in anger and trying to pretend like her hand didn't hurt, she yelled at the detective. My son couldn't possibly have done this out of free will. Namasa remained firm in front of the mother's cry. Inko put her palms on the table and faced it, letting her tears fall on the flat piece of furniture. I have spent the last 14 years of my life looking out for him, making sure that at any given moment, he'd be safe, all because of the illness that I gave him. Namasa's gaze softened at Inko's outpour of emotion. He couldn't function during the first 4 years of his life, he was scared of his own shadow, he barely smiled at all back then. He got better once he and Kitsuki were introduced, but even then he was still scared of everything. He would break down regularly, at the slightest of stimuli, and even when his panic attacks got rarer and rarer, he still couldn't stand the thought of going anywhere without his face coverings, he even stopped letting me see his face unless I had to. He has always been like this, scared, afraid of the world around him, retreating at the slightest sign of danger, he wouldn't be able to hurt a fly even if he wanted to. Inko sniffled, balled up her hands into a tight fist, and spoke to Namasa in a voice shaking in contempt. And you're expecting me to believe that he wanted to do this? That he was in any way in control? No. No, I can't believe that. I won't believe that. Namasa sighed, he felt for Inko, he truly did. Control or no control, what happened did happen and nothing will change that. Perhaps the courts might give him a reduced sentence if it is deemed that he truly had no control over himself, or that this was simply an undiscovered quirk gone haywire, but for that to happen, I must bring this investigation to a close, I need to find out what happened down there and what events even lead to this in the first place. Inko sat back down and wiped her tears away, a shadow covering her eyes and her posture crooked. You're right. Namasa began again. So, you were saying that you helped All Might in the recovery process? Inko sighed. Well yes, but no. I did help All Might, but I didn't help in the recovery per se. Namasa raised an eyebrow. So, how did you help? Inko corrected her posture and sat more properly in her chair. I had seen Izuku on the news, he hadn't come home at the time he usually had, so I was worried and wanted to watch television to calm my nerves, that's when I first saw how Izuku had changed. It was a news photographer, I think, who took the picture I saw, it was before he had entered the sewers. You couldn't see his face, and his body had changed so much that I didn't recognize it was him immediately, but then I saw the pants, his hoodie and his hair, and I knew it was my Izuku. I saw from the way the back of his head looked that his mask and sunglasses had been removed somehow, and that's when I grabbed my purse and ran out the door as fast as I could. I knew that he must have been petrified, hurt or scared, I needed to go and help him, I had to. Not too long after, I arrived where the news broadcast said that he had stopped and demanded that they'd let me go see him, but they didn't let me. I argued with the officer there for a while, until All Might and another officer came and told him to allow me through. I thanked the two for allowing me to see my son, but I was too quick to assume. Inko put her elbows on the table and put her hands on top of each other. They refused to allow me to see him, I was angry and asked why they let me through if they weren't going to allow me to see my son. Inko sighed. I assumed the worst when they looked at each other before answering me, I thought they were gonna tell me that Izuku had died, but then they told me that Izuku had killed those rescuers. I still don't know if I was glad or sad at the revelation. I didn't respond to them at all, I was too in shock to do anything, but eventually, All Might spoke up and shook me out of my trance. He told me that he would go down there and bring Izuku out himself, but that evidently Izuku was not in a state of mind where he could be approached, that he was even worse than when he and the officer had seen him before the incident. Then, he asked me if I knew of anything that would calm him. Inko removed her hands from the table and laid them down on her thighs. Of course I know what would calm my son, I told him that Izuku was scopophobic, but the big lunk didn't understand what it meant, so I had to explain it to him. I explained to him how Izuku was sensitive to other people's gazes, and that if I was correct, he didn't have his face coverings at that moment, so the best way to approach him was to go into the sewers completely blind and cover his face with the coverings that I always bring with me. He questioned my judgment, but he shut up once I detailed how long I had cared for Izuku, and that if anyone knew how to approach him, it was me or his doctor. So, before he climbed down into the sewer, he ripped one of his sleeves off to use as a blindfold, and I gave him the medical mask and pair of sunglasses that I hope Izuku is still wearing now. All Might went down, got Izuku, came back up and the rest, I think you know. Naomasa finished scribbling in his notebook and sighed. The detective thought back to a certain part of the story. All Might and the officer had met Izuku before he had gone on a rampage in the sewers. When? Why? That officer you said was with All Might, do you know his name? I'm not sure. I think it was Takahashi. All Might only ever said his name once, so I can't say for sure. Naomasa nodded and noted the name down. He'd have to bring All Might and the officer in for questioning later. They might be able to finally piece this whole timeline together. Still, the question of how Izuku was triggered in the first place and what happened to the bodies still remained. Ms. Midoriya, well, your son might have always been meek, can you recall any time at all where he lashed out? Exploded in anger or out of fear? Inko closed her eyes, annoyed at the redundant question. No, like I've told you already, Izuku couldn't and hasn't. Inko opened her eyes wide in realization, causing Naomasa to raise an eyebrow. Actually now that you mention it. Once, there was one time where Izuku responded in anger to something that scared him. When was that? What happened? Well. It was when Izuku and Kitsuki had first met, they were 4, he had convinced Izuku to allow him a peek at his face, and Izuku punched him so hard he flew across the room and into a wall. If I remember well, he shattered a tooth. And he didn't transform as he did during the incident. No, he didn't, he just broke down right after, I had to come in to calm him, luckily Kitsuki was okay. So Izuku and Kitsuki knew each other? Maybe that would explain why Izuku didn't kill Kitsuki, not only had he already seen his face, but he was also a childhood friend. Not only that, but it explained why Izuku broke out of that police cruiser. Perhaps his quirk wasn't activated by people seeing his face, but by stress. Seeing his friend being held hostage must have stressed him enough to send him into a frenzy, and his worst fear coming true would have sent him over the edge and sent his quirk into virtual overdrive, resulting in the violent transformation that took place. Naomasa was satisfied, some questions still remained, but many had been answered. Naomasa got up from his chair. Thank you for your time, Ms. Midoriya, this has greatly helped in the investigation. Inko narrowed her eyes at the detective. Can I see my son now? Yes, of course, I am a man of my word. Inko finally sighed in relief. They both left the questioning room and proceeded toward the cells, Izuku's crying becoming louder and louder. Eventually, they saw Izuku huddled up in a dark corner of his cell crying to himself. Inko immediately cried out Izuku's name and ran to his cell bars, grabbing them and urgently telling Naomasa to open the door. Naomasa complied and unlocked the cell's doors for the green-haired mother, who proceeded to run in and stop dead in her tracks when she heard Izuku's deep raspy voice. Mom. Inko held her breath, she could now clearly see Izuku. She had seen how he had transformed, but it didn't get any easier seeing her son in such a state. She desperately wanted to walk towards her son, but something in her stopped her. She felt her every sense telling her that danger was near. She felt her very soul pulling at her, trying to get her to turn away from Izuku. She was scared, petrified of the thing before her, it terrified her down to her very bones. Inko took a step back and was going to exit the cell until Izuku spoke once again, now more clearly and in a higher pitch of voice. Mommy? How could she had allowed herself to think the way she did? This wasn't a monster, this wasn't a thing, this was her son. She scolded herself for having even considered running away and ran toward Izuku, wrapping the young greenette in a bone-crushing hug and crying into his ripped hoodie, repeating how sorry she was over and over again. Izuku's crying stopped completely, he stood still for a few seconds and then slowly wrapped his enormous arms around his mother, enveloping her in a tight hug. The two Midoriyas continued hugging each other for a minute. Naomasa was about to turn and leave to give the two some privacy, but he was stopped once he heard Inko gasp in pain. Izuku's grip had suddenly tightened into a vice grip, clearly hurting Inko. The detective was about to pull out a revolver to prevent the mother from being hurt, but never got the chance to as Izuku threw his mother out of the cell. Naomasa ran and crouched down to help Inko, who was coughing and gasping, trying to get air back into her lungs. Once she felt better, the two turned to Izuku who had started flailing and screaming in pain. They gasped in horror as blood started pouring from all over Izuku's body. They stared at the horror unfolding in front of them. It almost looked like Izuku was being crushed from the inside. He was getting smaller and smaller, his limbs were becoming shorter and shorter, and they could hear the sound of flesh tearing and organs being pressed into a paste. After 5 minutes of torture, Izuku finally stopped screaming and fell to the ground, now the size he was before the incident happened. Izuku whimpered in pain, he trembled on the ground in the fetal position. Inko got up, grunting in pain, and approached Izuku, crouching down so she was at his side. She could hear Izuku trying to whisper something, but couldn't make out what he was saying, so she approached her ear towards her son's mouth to hear what her son wanted to say. Mom. It hurts. Please help me. Thanks for watching guys, make sure to leave a like, share and subscribe. Also don't forget to check out author of this story. All details in description.